Okay, good morning, everyone. It is 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock your time, right? Yes, so 9 o'clock Missouri time. I would like to thank everybody for coming today and joining us for the presentation. It's titled The Surprising History of the New Madrid Earthquakes. Our host today is Conaveri Fulton Valencius, and she is a professor of history at Boston College. She works on the history of science, energy, and environment, and occasionally teaches the history of the U.S. Civil War. She's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She has a PhD in the history of science from Harvard University, and is the author of 2 books. One is titled The Lost History of the New Madrid Earthquakes, and the other is The Health of the Country, How American Settlers Understood Themselves and Their Land, which won the 2003 George Perkins Marsh Prize from the American Society for Environmental History. I'm also going to drop the link of those books into the chat. She's currently finishing a book about fracking related to earthquakes. This semester, she is teaching Powering America, which is a course on the history and the technology of the United States energy that is part of the Boston College core that she co-teaches along with a seismologist and a marine ecologist. Conaveri, over to you.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad, I guess, not exactly to see you all, but to at least share a virtual space with you all. So I'm speaking to you from Boston, where it's a little bit later in the morning. It's a beautiful sunny day here, but I want to emphasize that I'm not just zooming in. I've spent some really serious quality time in the New Madrid Seismic Zone. My kids, 2 of them, were born in St. Louis when I was there as a professor at Washington University in St. Louis. And I grew up not far from where y'all are in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so it always makes me very happy to get to connect with a place that is still very much feels like home to me. So thanks so much for this invitation, and thanks for y'all's time. So many of you all know a different view of this region than a whole lot of people do. That is, you know something about the seismic history of this part of the Mississippi Valley. I didn't. I came across this with great surprise. So when I was a grad student researching the stuff that was my dissertation, ended up becoming my first book on health and environment in the 19th century, I read accounts of people talking about earthquakes in the early 19th century. In particular, I read about Davy Crockett out hunting bears in West Tennessee on a really cold winter night. He was following his pack of hunting dogs, leaping over what he called earthquake cracks. Eventually, a bear got cornered by his dogs, couldn't get up into a tree, so the bear crawled down into one of the larger of these cracks where it wedged itself and was fighting off the dogs. Crockett then crawled in behind the bear where it couldn't turn around, knifed it to get the bear's nice thick fur and fat and bear meat. Later on, Crockett's hunting partner and his pack of dogs caught up with Crockett and looked down into the crack and said he wouldn't have crawled in there not for all the bears in the woods. Because after all, as Crockett explained, we were right then in the area that had been shaken to pieces by the shakes in 1812. They felt another quake that night, and he said, we worried it might take a notion, the earth might take a notion and swallow us up like the great fish did Jonah. Now, Davy Crockett was no marine biologist. Whales are not fish, they are mammals, but he was a keen observer of his local environments. I thought I was too, and I had no idea what he was writing about. So after I got done with this book, I decided to figure out what was going on in the winter of 1811 and 1812. Why is it that someone with such a good knowledge of what was going on would talk about earthquakes and earthquake cracks? I wrote a book to figure that out. So The Lost History of the New Madrid Earthquakes came out with University of Chicago Press about a dozen years ago, 10 years ago. And in this book, I try to say, well, what happened? And what does that mean? And what can we do about that? What I'm going to do in the next little bit of time is tell you a little bit of what I discovered and maybe a few aspects of what might be useful about that history for folks who are doing their best to prepare the people of Missouri for emergencies beforehand and to respond to them after. So on a December night, 1811, the people in the French and American communities along a little bend of the Mississippi River were shaken awake by huge roaring noises and rolling terrain. They saw flashes of light and lightning in the sky. They smelled sulfur, and they knew what that was about. People in the 19th century, when they smelled sulfur, they feared hell, right? Water came rising up out of fissures in the earth, threatening to drown them and their children and their livestock. Whole forests started waving with the undulations of the earth, huge trees cracking midway up their branches, midway up their trunks. People also in the Delaware and Shawnee settlements nearby must also have experienced this. We don't have their writings to tell us this, but the quakes were felt, or these experiences were felt far up and down the Mississippi Valley, and for a lot of the middle part of the United States. The sensations were most severe right on what was then the western edge of what this fairly new nation of the United States was claiming. So this is a period map showing the kind of extent of North America that the U.S. had, at least to some extent, claimed and bounded and put nice, neat boundaries on. And these quakes were happening where a lot of Americans didn't have a good understanding of what was going on. When I first started working on this project, my kids were still, well, now they're all much taller than I am, but they were still really little. And my boys were very upset to learn that I was not, in fact, writing a history of land pirates, but in fact of earthquakes. So the sensations were most extreme, as many of you all know, on this little bend of what we now call the boot heel of Missouri around the trading town of New Madrid. And it is with great pleasure that I do not have to explain to this audience that I'm not making a mistake. That is, in fact, how you pronounce it, New Madrid. A series of tremors shook the landscape in that whole winter. In December, and then again in January, and then again in February. And those were only the biggest of literally thousands of earthquakes that shook the terrain all along that winter and for years to come. So up through the 1840s, it was sort of a party trick that locals would take somebody who was visiting out and have them hold on to a cedar fence post planted deep in the earth. And you could sometimes feel just that little bit of tremble of cedar. Travelers by the 1830s would have to hire out horses and mules from that region because quadrupeds from other parts of North America were not used to so much seismic activity and would get spooked and might throw you. The tremors shook wide swaths of the country, shaking up both settled communities and making news that was felt really out to the news traveled really quickly out to the East Coast as well. I'm going to focus on some of the environmental effects, mostly because those are the ones that have great photos, and I couldn't put that many pictures in my book. So in one of the most dramatic effects of these earthquakes, in the fertile floodplain of the Mississippi River, the earth, as many of you all know really well, has a really high water table. There's a lot of real sandy underlayer. And when that land was put under great, great pressure, the same kind of thing happens as when you're at a beach and you kind of squish really wet sand in between your toes and it starts squelching up like the formerly solid sand is water. In the same way, sand that was under the surface got squelched and scorched like water, and under great pressure from these earthquake waves shot up into the air, showering fountains of white sand on either side, creating huge conical displays of what was for a long time white sand, called sand blows or sand boils. This is called soil liquefaction, and it is a feature of earthquakes in a number of parts, in many parts of the world. Usually sand blows are like the size of saucers or maybe dinner plates, or maybe the big ones are like the size of platters. Some of the sand blows in the New Madrid region have been measured up to 1/2 kilometer. So this is a mildly colorized photo to show you what, in fact, as many of y'all may know, human eyes can usually see in the springtime when the fields are just getting ready to be planted after a rain. Then you can still see the eroded down, plowed down remains of these ghostly white circles on fields. The tumult of the earthquakes created a phenomenon known as land subsidence. So, and this was documented 100 years later by one of the first investigations, or first kind of documentations of these earthquakes effects, done by a U.S. Geological Survey geologist named Myron Fuller. In his book, The New Madrid Earthquake, published on the centennial of the quakes, he documented effects such as these cypress trees that had clearly grown one set of roots. And then cypress trees are real sturdy about shaking and wind, and they can deal with a lot of water. The water level, the land subsided, and the trees actually had to grow themselves a second set of roots. The earthquakes stopped up a number of local waterways and creeks, including Reelfoot Creek, creating, as y'all know, Reelfoot Lake. So you can still, if you fly above it, see these sort of ghastly cypress, really long, trees that live a long time after disturbance, still living and still popping up above the earth, although they had been flooded out 200 years before, some of them. This image will not win any National Geographic Awards. I know it was a really hazy day, but I'm really quite proud of this and a bunch of the other of the aerial photos, because they're evidence of the single most best use of research funds ever in my entire academic career. When I first started studying the New Madrid earthquakes, I was talking with a colleague of mine, a very serious scholar who studies the work of Anton Chekhov. And I said, I'm studying these earthquakes that happen down not far from us in the New Madrid area, but I don't really know that region. I'd really like it if I could get some kind of bird's eye view. And he said, well, I'm a licensed pilot, and I'm co-owner of a single prop plane. So my research funds bought him a tank of gas, and I got these photos. The earthquakes created features on the terrain. Like if any of y'all read French, you'll see here both the squiggly swampy lines of the swampland created by both land subsidence and the disturbance to formerly free-flowing waterways. And some of y'all may notice here, there's the Lac du Tremblement de Terre, earthquake lake, that is not on any other period maps, probably eroded in, filled in really soon after this period map was made. Swamp East Missouri was substantially created by these earthquakes. What had been watery terrain crisscrossed by free-flowing streams became instead swampy morass as former drainage got clogged up by changing land elevations in the quakes. Before I started working on this, thought of earthquakes as something that happened to Earth. But in fact, these tremors had serious effects upon the Mississippi River. So the earthquakes would create waves that would slosh way over to one side of the river. And this is not the Mississippi River that has been dammed and channelized. This was a Mississippi that was easily a mile from one way to another, that was much shallower, broader, interrupted with all kinds of islands and interruptions. And the waves would slosh from one side of the river and then bounce against the banks on the other and slosh back. So travelers were caught in a kind of like a sloshing bathtub of Mississippi River that destroyed many craft. So folks along the river and down in New Orleans reported the wreckage of many, many watercraft floating down in the weeks after each of these tremors. And in one of the most dramatic effects of the earthquake, it destroyed whole islands. So islands in the Mississippi River were really kind of glorified sandbars with some vegetation on them. And as could happen in a series of spring floods, the dramatic movement of these earthquake waves eroded out whole islands. And in one particularly noted instance, a group of travelers who got caught in one of the big quakes hastily anchored to a small island to try to wait it out. All night long, they heard roaring and scraping and didn't know what was going on, came up above deck the next morning to find that the island they had anchored at was gone. There was just a little clump of sand left. So in this and in other ways, the earthquakes amplified and did much faster effects that were familiar on the river from ordinary spring floods. In one of those, the earthquakes amplified the flow of the waterway of the Mississippi to erode out, to eat out that bend right by New Madrid. So if you stand on the observation deck, as this is part of my family here, as we did, and look out over the Mississippi River, you're standing and looking out over what had been dry land in 1811 and 1812. The earthquakes, and also I meant to tell you also that the earthquakes did in fact lift up a part of the floor of the Mississippi River enough to force the river briefly but spectacularly to flow backwards. It soon eroded and kept flowing toward the mouth of toward the Gulf of Mexico, but for a brief time, the earthquakes actually did make the Mississippi flow backward in its course. The earthquakes were big news. Newspaper reports from all over the country talked about the earthquakes, debated their causes, reprinted and carried news from travelers. The earthquakes were also part of family letters and all kinds of ordinary documentation. So for instance, this letter: "We've had several alarming shocks of earthquake and still continue to feel, as we had 2 slight ones last week. And while the volcanoes remained unexhausted, similar or more fatal effects may be expected." And I show you this letter for a couple of reasons. First, I'd really like to impress you that historians work very, very hard because we have to read writing like this. Second, to say that these earthquakes mattered to ordinary people's lives. They weren't just some sort of abstract thing, but they were something that people felt, they worried about, for instance, that might be fatal to them, to their children, might destroy the land they depended upon. And also that mention of volcanoes, because this writer was like many people in the United States at that time in trying to figure out the causes of these earthquakes, in trying to suss out. And many people either saw or heard rumors and fourth-hand reports of the sand blows that looked like white sandy volcanoes spewing hot water and sand. It was widely reported that there were volcanoes in the middle of the United States, somewhere out in North America, that might be causing these earthquakes. Many other people theorized that the Earth, there were lots of theories of the Earth in the early 19th century that involved chambers underground that might be filled with fluid. So people were trying to figure out the scientific causes of what was happening. They seized upon any physical evidence of the quakes. For instance, a bison skull from an extinct bison, the species, that was spewed out, reportedly, of a sand blow and left upon the surface of the earth. This is not that skull. That particular skull was lost in a natural history collection sometime in the late 19th century. This is another bison skull from a modern, still alive bison species that was taken to the Arkansas Archaeological Survey because people thought it might be really, really old. And it turns out to be old, but not in no way prehistoric. But I wanted to give this to you as a representation of the ways in which people were curious. They wanted to find out, and they sought explanations. And indeed, we still seek those explanations because we still don't fully understand why it is that the New Madrid earthquakes happened. We know that most earthquakes happen when big tectonic plates on the earth move up and down against each other, or one goes under the other. Why that happens in the middle of North America, like in a few other places in the middle of tectonic plates, we're not fully sure. We know a lot about the effects. We know some things about the characteristics of those earthquakes, and there are a number of pretty good theories about why they happen, but it's something that seismologists are still struggling to fully understand. People of the 19th century sought to understand what was going on in scientific terms, and they also sought to understand what was going on in terms of religion and faith. People turned to God. White Christians flocked to religious revivals and repented. The earthquakes fueled what was known as the Second Great Revival, or the Second Great Awakening, in which they promised themselves and their souls to God and asked God's help in saving them from what was clearly a call to repent of their bad activity. Native peoples in a couple of different cultures likewise created the spiritual rituals of spiritual renewal, calling on their faith and their gods to help. We don't have as much direct evidence about Black Americans living in slavery, but we do know that there is a really wide set of, for instance, songs and spirituals that remain in which people were trying to work out what God was saying to them through the movement of the natural world. So across cultures and across the ethnicities of North America in the early 1800s, people turned to faith, to spirituality, looked inward and looked to God as when they were frightened by what was happening in the world around them. So, in my formal, considered historian's opinion, the New Madrid earthquakes were a really big deal in 1811 and 1812. How could they be so forgotten? How could I have grown up in that area and had no idea until I got to graduate school on the East Coast what was going on with these? So I'm going to talk about a little about that and say, maybe offer some suggestions about what these quakes might tell us about emergency preparation and disaster planning in our present day. And I should have said too that as we go along, I welcome your questions, so please feel free to put any questions in the chat. I'm going to argue that these New Madrid quakes were forgotten for some reasons that were social, that had to do with changing populations, changing priorities, changing stories about that part of the world. They were forgotten for reasons that were environmental, that had to do with use of natural resources that changed the landscape and made evidence of the quakes less visible. And they were forgotten for reasons that are scientific, changing ways in which people investigated the earth and changing credibility of certain kinds of scientific source. You might notice, by the way, the keen-eyed might look at these plants and say, huh, those cotton plants look a little blurry, almost as if those photos were taken from a moving car, almost as if the historian taking them had a car full of children who were close to rioting after an entire day spent looking at evidence of sand blows. I believe at that point I had dragged my children out on a forced march to Fort Pillow. All they really wanted to do was finish our cross-country drive and get to those grandparents. As one of my kids plaintively said from way back in the back of the minivan, "Mom, you keep taking us to places where something happened once a really long time ago and you can't see it anymore." So at this point in our day, the entire family united in a resolution that I could no longer make them get out and walk around, and I had to just take pictures from a slowly moving car, as I did. So some of the evidence that I found researching these earthquakes came through the excellent and really hard work of the Missouri Department of Local Records, which through really terrific organization has found a lot of local records that are just vital to telling the state's history that used to be really hard to locate. And through their help, I was able to find, literally in the basement of the New Madrid County Courthouse, a whole bunch of probate records that were thought to have been destroyed. And these probate records told a story of thriving communities of immigrants moving west from the east coast of the United States, moving west to find new opportunity, make new lives for themselves, to claim new lands full of hope and ambition, creating new societies with new kinds of transportation networks and diplomacy and making links with new peoples. Those societies got really disrupted by these earthquakes. And in fact, most of them had to move further west. Those societies and those settlements and those villages were largely Native American. And that's why we don't know about them in most of our histories. We're starting to much more. Many of the people and settlements whose lives were disrupted by the earthquake were the people who typically did not count in historical records at that time or in our history telling later. They were Indian people from a variety of Eastern tribes, especially the Cherokee people. There were French American settlers. They were rivermen, mixed race people, some escaped slaves. They were poor white people. All the folks who mattered were typically far away from this particular region. So this illustration from a later 19th century newspaper of the so-called sunken lands of Arkansas, the depiction here of the headdress, like that's a little anachronistic. That's probably not what people would have been wearing. But the fact that there are native people in that kind of watercraft, in that watery environment, that's in fact quite accurate to the early 19th century situation here. And that's and the fact that those were the people experiencing the earthquake is part of why those earthquakes didn't get carried forward in our historical record. And there's the Civil War. In US history, it always comes down to the Civil War. The Union campaign, the American campaign to retake the Mississippi River from the Confederacy came down to a couple of key battles, and one of them took place just off of the town of New Madrid. So we're looking here south down the Mississippi River toward New Orleans. The jut of land sticking out on the right is the little bitty town of New Madrid. Island number 10 has the big billowing cloud of smoke. Islands were numbered sequentially from the mouth of the Ohio down. So this was the number 10th island. And that was a Confederate redoubt. It was a good place to have a fort for the Confederacy because the land on the other side there across from New Madrid was too swampy. You couldn't make a troop attack. So the only way in which that fort would be able to be breached would be would be by forces coming down the river with the current. So in a combined Army-Navy attack in April of 1862, U.S. forces, aided by people who had freed themselves from slavery and very hot and a bunch of soldiers, dug a canal to try to cut off the town of New Madrid. And then the commanders dropped down in these new fancy armored steamboats down below the fort on island number 10, and then anchored and steamed back up, shelling it from the angle that its batteries weren't equipped to defend against. And the Confederates had to immediately abandon their post and flee, thus, in a fairly bloodless battle, taking this key part of the Middle Mississippi River back for the United States. So this meant a key victory in the logistical force of the United States in this bloody Civil War. And it also meant that stories after the war about this part of the world talked about the Battle of Island number 10, not about the earthquake terrain and the earthquake swamps that had set the conditions for that whole Confederate fort and the subsequent battle. So those are social reasons why stories about the earthquakes changed. So too, or got hidden, and there are also environmental reasons. The extensive timbering and lumbering that harvested the wealth of natural bounty of southeast Missouri also unintentionally destroyed evidence of the earthquakes. So old growth timber like this was one of the major industries of the late 19th century in southeast Missouri, northeast Arkansas. And those, as those trees were cut down, that changed some of the evidence. So this is, again, from Myron Fuller's USGS report on the centennial of the quakes. This is evidence, key evidence for earthquakes. And I didn't see it for a very long time. I had to have geologists, as usual, explain stuff to me because I am so unfamiliar with old growth forest like this that I didn't understand what this picture conveyed. So this is man on a horse, probably Fuller's guide, for scale, next to a tree, a big old tree. It's really large. It's very, very old. And look where it's growing. It's growing in an area where the land slumps down suddenly. Now, around here in New England, you wouldn't give that a second thought. In Mississippi River floodplain, that much change in elevation of land, that much topographic change is actually quite significant. That is, in fact, a fault scarp where the land has changed suddenly because of an earthquake. And in the middle of that fault scarp is growing a tree that is older than 100 years old in 1912. Fuller was documenting what several native informants had told him, which was that the earthquakes that happened in 1811, 1812 were only the most recent wave of such earthquakes to have hit the Mississippi Valley. He was able to do that partly because of this, the scale of the trees nearby. Trees which were in the process of being timbered out. And in the early 19th century, huge topographic and geographic change came to the Missouri Boot Heel through the Little River Drainage District. So in this project, similar in scope to the digging of the Panama Canal and involving some of the same kinds of equipment, men and mules wrought enormous change upon the countryside, aided by whole families that moved out to the Boot Heel to dig out drainage ditches, creating a new hydrology in that region. Huge machines tore down the forests, drained ditches, getting rid of mosquitoes, getting rid of all that swampy water. One of my favorite images, maintaining the openness of the ditches in part through dramatic explosions, creating a new topography of the Boot Heel, cutting straight lines through natural space that didn't have them before. Creating at the era of the Great War, a kind of topography that would soon become familiar to people looking at images of the horrible war to end all wars and trench warfare. That is straight lines with the straight horizons with trenches dug through them. Here, not to hide from enemies, but rather to drain out swamp water. And this environmental transformation worked, cutting these new straight line topography that's, these ditches are still visible in the terrain today. And it created, out of swampland, extraordinarily fertile farming soil. So Boot Heel swamps became places to grow cotton, right? Some of the best soil for food and fiber that the world has ever seen. That environmental transformation meant that what environmental evidence of the earthquakes was much less visible, was much less interpretable, sometimes wasn't even there. It also meant that new people moved onto the terrain, bringing new conflicts and new stories. Many of the folks who came to farm cotton were people who had recently freed themselves from slavery, people who were maybe a generation, maybe two, or maybe themselves had lived in slavery, who came to farm cotton. Southeast Missouri, Northeast Arkansas became centers for some of the most virulent and violent instances of U.S. homegrown domestic terrorism that our country had seen so far, when white men terrorized Black American families trying to make a living in the Boot Heel and in Northeast Arkansas. So in the African American press of that region, of that era, you can see that this part of the world became notorious as a place where it often wasn't safe to be after sundown, where Black families could be driven out. And that history became what many Americans knew about the region, not a history of earthquakes. Similarly, during the Great Depression, the really pioneering Southern Tenant Farm Workers Union made their roadside demonstration along the public roads at the boot heel, trying to call attention to sharecroppers who weren't sharing in any of the federal aid given to landowners in the Great Depression. Newspaper reporters and photographers from all around the country came to cover this. The savvy protesters had, gotten them to come raise awareness of this problem. And that meant, again, that the stories people told at the boot heel had nothing to do with earthquakes, but rather to do with agrarian poverty or social justice. So those are all social and environmental reasons for the invisibility of the New Madrid earthquakes. There are also scientific reasons. So I give you here a newspaper article, a scientific journal report from 1889. This is also a key scientific primary source, because what this shows, what this reproduces in this grainy newsprint, is seismograph readings from a station in Germany of earthquakes reported at that same time in Japan. And what that meant was that this Tokyo quake could be registered, could be quantified, could be visualized, could be recorded from anywhere in the world. And this revolution in the 1880s, between the 1880s and the 1920s, of self-registering seismic instruments, of seismographs that could record the Earth's movement, was a revolution in the earth sciences. It meant that to study earthquakes, scientists could actually use quantified records. Very soon, to be a seismologist meant to study instrumental records and to tend seismographs, as these earnest Jesuits are doing at St. Louis University in this obviously staged and quite charming photograph from the 1920s. This meant that records like that of Davy Crockett no longer held a lot of water. So already in Davy Crockett's own lifetime, his memoir was being garishly illustrated and read by, pale shop clerks in Boston yearning to go out west and have adventures. His stories of being a professional, a market hunter, a bear, became aggrandized and added to and somewhat lavishly illustrated, as in this story of him and his wife and son collectively taking down a bear. In the generations after, the mythology of Davy Crockett only grew. And I'm going to make a bet here that anybody my age or older, old enough to have been a child in the era where there were only 4 channels on the TV set, is mentally humming Davy, Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier. This made-for-TV special was repeated endlessly in after-school specials and every summer. When I was a kid, my little brother had this coonskin cap, or a replica of it. And most people I have talked to about these stories are mostly surprised to know that Davy Crockett was a real guy. Yes, he was he was part of the U.S. legislature from Tennessee. He spoke for Indian rights. He was a real hunter. Yet the stories of people like Davy Crockett became mythologized, seemed like American tall tales. His stories of earthquake cracks were like, stories of Paul Bunyan, not anything that real serious people needed to take into account, certainly not anything that anyone needed to understand as part of a scientific record. And then came an earthquake prediction of 1990. By a one-time meteorologist named Ibn Browning, who, based on a complicated and completely unreasonable set of assumptions and theories about the gravitational pull and so on, predicted not only that the New Madrid earthquakes would recur, yes, they will, but that they would do so on a particular day in December of 1990. And many of y'all, again, of a certain age will remember being in Missouri at that time and the fuss and the concern that overtook many school districts. Colleagues of mine at WashU said that they were rumored to have the rumor was that departments at WashU were issued a crowbar to get themselves out of the wreckage after the earthquake happened. Probably not true, but it made a great story. The St. Louis Dispatch offered earthquake preparation kits. National media descended upon New Madrid. And then on that appointed day, in as dramatic a way as nothing could happen, Nothing happened. With the result that serious talk of a repeat New Madrid quake became like a punchline, right? Became ridiculous, became ridiculed. Many folks in the region felt sheepish. Many scientists had trouble getting funding. I've talked to scientists who said, like the NSF wasn't going to fund me after that. And what I've noticed in watching social media over now the past 2 decades is the way in which the New Madrid earthquakes have become a kind of lightning rod for many forms of conspiracy theory. That it's something that is sort of regarded as, see, I've found this and it's really true, but they don't want you to know about it. So I've located stuff online about the New Madrid earthquakes being related to avian flu, being related to peril to nuclear reactors. I saw one posting that somehow was blaming the threat of New Madrid earthquakes on then President Obama. So the sort of tin hat conspiracy theories coalesce around the New Madrid quakes to a really interesting extent, making it hard to see them as a real thing that happened and as a real concern of the present day. So, what changed? Why are the New Madrid quakes remembered now? Why are they something that probably most of y'all here have some familiarity with, I would imagine, or may know a lot about? So one answer has to do with science, has to do with the discipline of paleoseismology, in which dendrochronologists study in cypress trees in the boot heel, join with archaeologists looking at human cultural remains, join with soil scientists talking about different layers of like how you can see disturbance in the soil. And in these really dramatic trenches dug in the boot heels, you can see actually on the walls these sort of ghostly flowering of small sand blows, giving evidence of the 1811, 1812 quakes and those of hundreds and indeed thousands of years prior. And this new science, slowly over the course of about 30 years, has created a new consensus around both the reality of the New Madrid quakes, their importance at the time, and the importance of preparing for them. So as many of you all know, Missouri now is a leader in the Great Central U.S. Shakeout, earthquake preparation drills. I've talked to school kids now in Missouri who not only know about the New Madrid quakes, but have some sense of what to do in earthquakes. All of this has meant that earthquakes are no longer the kind of punchline or the rumor that they were when I was a kid growing up in this region. They are part of what practical people have to think about, plan for, and help each other prepare for. What you all do, as a matter of fact. Cannot resist a good pun. The earthquakes, instead of being a sort of folk story that gets made fun of, they are now recognized as our fault. Bump. So you all have learned, you all have helped teach others in the state how to re-see a different history, a different story about what's underneath this terrain. What does that mean for contemporary disaster planning? Well, one thing is that what I see in this historical record is that human beings really don't want to believe that really bad things can happen around us that we're not in control of. We really don't like to acknowledge that. And we will try very hard to not look at evidence, especially when it's not really easy to see. We will do our best not to pay attention to stuff that is scary. And when bad things do take place, we turn to science and we turn to faith to make sense of those events and to know what to do. So what might that suggest to us? A couple of things, and y'all probably have other lessons that I'd like to hear. What I've seen in the real success of earthquake preparation in Missouri and other states of the central US is that disaster planning and emergency management can work really well when it involves communities and connects with their values, their parishes, their interests. When disaster planning is consistent across fields, and by that I mean when the insurance commissioner of a state is saying the same thing as the folks from emergency management and is saying the same thing as folks are hearing at a Sunday sermon, then people start to believe it. And I think one of the things that I've seen to be crucial is when trusted local authorities support clearly articulated science. So when my pediatrician says the same thing as I'm hearing at a church coffee hour and says the same thing that I'm hearing in, a public service announcement, then that's something I believe. And when scientists are able to say not just what they know, but what they still don't know. And when they articulate the areas of uncertainty and the questions that remain. And I think that that's a key aspect of science being able to express, and scientists being willing to express the limits of their own knowledge. So I know it is cornball, but as I tell my students sometimes cornball things are true. Learning from the past does, I believe, help prepare us for the future. And I think that the lessons of the new Madrid earthquakes can help us in crafting emergency management and disaster preparation messages that can keep the people of Missouri and of the surrounding states safe when we face another big one. So thank you very, very much. And I welcome any of your questions.
You guys feel free to use the chat feature, or if you raise your hand, the little icon at the bottom, we can call on you and you can come off mute and ask your questions verbally as well.
And I'd be interested to see in the chat, was there any piece of what I said that you didn't know or that surprised you? Because I know a lot of this is to the great credit of disaster preparation agencies, to the great credit of y'all, a lot of this is much more known. So one of the things that really surprised me about this when I was starting to look was how differently people could interpret environmental evidence that they'd seen. So one of the cotton farmers and soybean farmers I talked to said, well, yeah, we'd always known that sand blows were part of our fields. And that was something you had to know because it, makes the cotton grow differently. Said, but that word sand blow, I thought they were something that had blown in on the wind. So one of the things that's really interesting to me is how different sort of the same physical evidence, like a white spot of sand in a field, can get interpreted differently depending on what's the frame of reference and what's the form of interpretation. And I just want to give a minute here to say, anybody see anything that you find interesting or that you find puzzling?
I thought the image of the tree was really powerful to me, because I would have seen a picture of a very large tree beside a very large horse on a little slope and not thought anything of it until you explained that the tree was very large because it's very old, and then the slope actually does have a lot of meaning to it. It's not just a slope. It was from the earthquake.
That's right. That's right. And I'm interested here that someone in the chat is saying that parents talked about there being an earthquake. And one of the things that I find interesting is the way in which I haven't given a lot of talks, well, because of this pandemic. I haven't been in Missouri in a couple of years, at least say up through maybe about 5 years ago when I'd be there. Many people would come up to me with a kind of sense of delight and say, my great aunt would always tell me these stories, and I wasn't really sure they were true, right? And I just thought, well, maybe that's just Aunt Lizzie talking. And that kind of sense of like, oh, our family has a cave back on the back 40 that the story is that it used to have a spring and it didn't anymore after earthquakes, and this makes sense of it. So there's a way in which the history of these earthquakes never went away, but it sort of got muted or covered, or people didn't have the confidence that their family stories actually were meaningful. So for me, it's been a real pleasure to be able to say, well, my understanding of the geology, I'm not a seismologist, but those that that a lot of the family histories, just like some of the stories of indigenous peoples in the region, are actually ratified by modern science.
I see you're still sharing your screen. Can you still see the chat?
I'm just now, yes. So the spots like this all over. I mean, so one of the really interesting things to me was my buddy who took me up in the airplane. We said, all right. He said, what do we want to do? I said, well, I've read about these sand blows. I'd really like to see them. And he said, all right, great, we'll go up. And so we were flying across, and I knew to go out in the early spring, before things were really growing. We were looking and looking, and we were flying around. I was anxiously staring out the window. And then after a while, we sort of simultaneously had this revelation that they were all over the landscape we were looking at, but there were so many of them that I didn't understand that that's what they were. I thought, like, I was looking at all these circular spots all over, and I kind of thought, well, it's, pivot irrigation or something. Like, I was looking for something really hidden, but it was every place. One person saying that it's not that he didn't know that the earthquake caused the swamp. So one of the really cool things I was able to find in the historical record was evidence that the St. Francis River and what was then the Little River were free-flowing streams pre-1811. They were a way, actually, a lot of people used a river network that ran through southeast Missouri and northeast Arkansas rather than the Mississippi, because the Mississippi was sort of so huge and the currents and the it could just be so unmanageable, whereas smaller streams and rivers were easier for smaller boats to navigate. After 1811 and after 1812, that's when those areas, rather than being lots and lots of streams that would maybe seasonally overflow, they became swamps that were always overflown and always watery. And for people outside, well, it was a watery environment before, it's still a watery environment now. What's the difference? Well, if you're living near there, streams are very different from swamps, and that's what they became. Some people were farmed. So yes, in the earliest instance of disaster relief in the U.S. government, the Congress gave people who could prove they had U.S. title to lands equivalent amount of land elsewhere. So actually, much of the city of Little Rock, where I grew up, was settled by people using New Madrid claims. This was also, in addition to one of the first instance of domestic disaster relief in the United States, also an early episode of widespread graft. So these New Madrid certificates were the widespread subject of conniving and conning, duplicity. People were cheated out of them. They actually did very, very little to help the people they were trying to help, because they were just so, but a few families were able to use them. The western impact of the earthquakes, in Poplar Bluff, not so much. The sort of the harder area, well, let's see, as far west as St. Louis, basically where you get into hard rock, that shakes less. So it's really the areas of soft sedimentary deposit around the Mississippi, the kind of flat farmland along the Mississippi, that shook and shook and shook. And if any of y'all know anything about earthquakes elsewhere in the world, where you have what people call unconsolidated sediment, like really thick soils, that shakes and shakes and shakes. So a lot of folks grew up in this area. That's just great. Someone had said that they learned about the earthquake in junior high in the late 70s. That's pretty impressive in Nashville.
Yeah, that was Ron. Ron learned about it in Nashville in the late 70s.
Did anybody else hear about this in school, or when did you hear? Like, how old were you? If you put that in the chat, how old were you when you learned about the New Madrid Quakes? I'm always interested to know.
I'm not sure that I know. Like, I know I didn't learn about it in school. I knew about the fault line. I don't know that I actually heard about the earthquakes until, I don't know, not in elementary or middle school, maybe high school.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not
School
sure.
also. Yeah, elementary
And
school, 90s, at school. Oh, so a lot of folks learning it at junior high in the 90s, and it was a big deal, early 70s. Oh, an emergency manager from California. Wow, cool. And somebody learned in Missouri history class. What questions do people ask you all when you're engaged with them about any of y'all who do any kind of disaster planning or emergency prep? What kind of earthquake questions do you get? You know, oh, and somebody else learned Missouri history. Uh, yeah, a lot of people learn.
I'm not saying I didn't learn about it in Missouri history. I might have learned about it in Missouri history and forgot that I learned it. So I'm not blaming the teachers. I'm just,
Right.
can't be certain.
Well, what's interesting is I think, you know, if we had a group of, I don't know, 10th graders here now, I think they would all say like, oh, yeah, we know about this.
Yeah.
Because I think it is much more routinely taught. And it seems to me that there's a kind of, someone's defending the teachers here. Yep, it's not on the teachers. Oh, you got a statement from people in the state fair that it is never happening. Right. And one of the things about, as you all know, high impact, low probability events doesn't happen very frequently. It's very unlikely to happen this year, but when it does happen, it's going to be a big deal. That's some of the worst and hardest kind of science to communicate and risk preparation to communicate. So the earthquake rang church bells in Charleston, South Carolina. And remember, I talked about how newspapers would print accounts. That account got reprinted up in Boston. So it didn't ring, the news went to Boston. It didn't ring church bells in Boston, but it did ring them way out on the East Coast.
That's astonishing. Like that, just the magnitude is kind of puts it in perspective.
How will it affect Kansas City? The earthquake effects spread much more to the east. So the shaking went eastern more than western. And in general, eastern U.S. earthquakes, for instance, like the Mineral Virginia quake about 5 years ago, the earthquake tremors are felt over a much longer distance, and it has to do with the rocks there being, geologically speaking, older and colder. Whereas in the West Coast, the rocks absorb more of the shaking, so you might have a stronger earthquake, but it's not felt over as wide a distance. Well, thank you all very much. Well, I want to say before we finish up, thank you to all of you all who've been part of this, because it is a real pleasure and an honor to me, who studies old disasters, to be able to talk with the people who are making a difference in the present day world. So thank y'all very much. I really appreciate your time.
And I want to thank you for, you're busy too, and just coming here today. I think this is the 5th course that we've hosted this month so far, and this has been by far the most engaging, interactive, almost just, this has been absolutely fantastic. So I cannot thank you enough for sharing all of this with us today.
What a pleasure. Thank you all. And I hope you have a very seismically uninteresting day for the rest of your day.
You too. And I'm going to stay on in case anyone's still typing out questions or thoughts.
Sure. No, me too.
I'm going to turn the camera off so I can kind of monitor the chat, but I will stay on just to monitor.
Thank you for the interest in the book. I really appreciate that. Someone's typing in the chat. Oh. Yeah. I'm delighted you'll be buying the book. How wonderful. I'll go tell my editor.
Ooh, good idea.
There is a recording of this, I believe. Yes, Ashley?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep, I am recording it. So what I'm going to do is once I get the end cut out or I'm sorry, the beginning cut out to where we're just sitting there looking at the camera. Once I get it edited, I will post it to SEMA's YouTube page. And from the YouTube page, I will link that to our website. So, John, whenever you go to our website, I will link it right now. As soon as I can make these recordings available, I will, and it'll be on that page there, and you can access all of them.